Please welcome back to the Manchester Community Library, Barry Deitz.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a joy to be here. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
I can hear myself echoing off the walls. That's usually a good sign. Thanks for coming out. It is always tough for libraries, to get people to come out and participate, and here you are. So thank you. Thank you for supporting your library and supporting this wonderful facility here and for having me back. All right, Emily Dickinson. I was originally going to call this program Emily Dickinson Outside, because we think of her so much as an indoor poet. Certainly when you get her poetry is when you're in high school, which should be the first place we encounter it. It tends to be the story of the recluse. We get the story of the white dress. We get the person scurrying up the stairs to get away when company comes in, or listening to someone play the piano downstairs but never actually coming downstairs herself. And so to discover, as I did, as part of this program, that she was very much active out in her garden. Her poetry's full of garden images and flowers and plants, but I had never quite put that together with the fact that the garden she had at her house, behind her, the home she lived in, grew up in, was a huge part of her own creativity. And so that became what I became fascinated with, and that's what I wanted to look at. So we're going to start with a meeting. This man is Thomas Wentworth Higginson. And on August the 16th, 1870, he has arrived in Amherst. And he goes up to this house. This house is called the Homestead. It's an important house in town when it has a title. This is the Homestead, the home of Edward Dickinson. It is the first brick house in Amherst. And Edward Dickinson is a lawyer, and he's been a politician. He's been in the Congress. His father built the house and then lost it in some complications, and so he has gotten it back. And Higginson is here to meet the daughter, a rather odd figure that he has been in contact with for several years. In fact, 8 years before, he had written an article for the Atlantic Monthly. Now, Higginson was a very popular writer. He was a well-traveled man. He had been a soldier in the Civil War where he had been injured. He had led the 1st Black Regiment. He had been an advocate of abolition all through his life, and then women's equality after the war. So he had done a lot of stuff. And he was a founder and one of the editors of the Atlantic Monthly. And he wrote an article in the April issue of the Atlantic Monthly back in 1862 called Advice to a Young Contributor: How to Write an Article for the Magazine. Well, his editor, George Tickner, said, "Oh, what are you doing? We're going to get flooded with all kinds of junk now." But Higginson thought otherwise. He thought, no, let's reach out and find out who's out there. And he gets a letter from a young lady in Amherst. He opens it up, and the beginning of this letter is one of the most famous moments in American literature. He looks the letter over, there's no signature. But the letter starts, "Mr. Higginson, are you too deeply occupied to say if my verse is alive? The mind is too near itself. It cannot see distinctly. I have none to ask. Should you think it breathe, and you had the leisure to tell me, I should feel quick gratitude." And sure enough, there are 4 poems included with this letter. And a little bitty envelope that when he opens it up, he takes out a card, and the name Emily Dickinson is written in pencil on the little card. What an intriguing little mailing, huh? So he becomes fascinated and curious. He sends letters back to her. His letters to her have not survived, which I will mention later on. But we know from her letters back to him that he told her that her poetry was uncontrolled, it was spasmodic, and he recommended that perhaps she not try to publish it as it is. She told him she had no intention of publishing, and yet she would send him almost 70 poems over the course of the next 20 years. And so 8 years later, they have never met. He has asked her to come to Boston, and she says, "I do not leave the house." And so here he is He hands his card in. He goes in to the parlor right there on the left-hand side, and he hears footsteps upstairs, and then delicate feet coming down the stairs, and a woman walks into the parlor. She's small. She has her hair pulled back. She's wearing a white dress and a blue shawl wrapped around it. And she walks up to him, and she holds out her hands. And in her hands, she is holding 2 daylilies. And she says, "This is my introduction." Now, she goes on to talk for quite a while. Higginson is absolutely fascinated by her and a little frightened of her, I think. Later on, after this is the first real account we have of someone sitting down talking to Emily Dickinson. We have her family talking about her and letters from friends, but this is someone who did not know her, who sat down, and he said it just poured, it just unflowed out of her. And he found himself sitting riveted. That night when he went back to his hotel, he wrote a letter to his wife where he told her. And he even said at the end of it, I don't think I could live here because I think it would be too intense to be near her often. And so when we think of her, we think of this, right? The one photograph. The daguerreotype taken when she was 16 or 17 years old. She had probably just finished at Amherst Academy here. And look here, if my clicker works. Yeah, there we are. So looky there. And she's holding flowers there too. How about that? Every story with Emily Dickinson seems to come with some sort of flowers. And this is her garden. Well, this is what they think her garden may have looked like. And this is the garden they're in the process of recreating at the homestead in Amherst. In 2016, they excavated. There was like an archaeological excavation of her garden, or rather where her garden had been. They dug it up. They looked for plant samples to kind of figure out what had been put there. And they're trying to recreate that. And this is part of that. So you can see here, so this is the house here. This is the main street that's coming right here. And then that's the house, that's the homestead and the barn behind it. And then up here, she had grape trellises, figs, lilacs, roses. And then all through here, boxed out. And this is their attempt to recreate what they think it may have looked like. By the time she became famous and legendary, and people started coming to Amherst wanting to see where she lived, most of this had all fallen apart, including the house. And so all of it is now open as a museum, and they're trying to recreate all of this. And flowers are in all of her work. She makes 600 references in her poems to flowers, 80 different types of plants, 350 just specifically flowers and especially roses. She loved roses. But before we go there, before we go to Emily Dickinson's garden, I want to give a little bit of backstory. I love backstory. So I want to set some things up before we move into Emily Dickinson's garden. John Locke once said, "In the beginning, all the world was America." When we think of the age of discovery, we tend to think of the discovery of a new continent. But of course, what the discovery really was a bunch of new stuff. New plants, new fruit, new landscapes, something no one had ever seen before. When we think about the conquest of America, and especially South America and Central America, we think of the awful stories of Cortez and Montezuma and Pizarro and Peru and the Incas and the Mayas. And these are such heartbreaking stories. But there were people who went to the New World and were stunned at the beauty and the variety that they saw there. Let me tell you about John Layfield. You've never heard of John Layfield. He's not famous at all. But in 1596, he was part of an expedition to the Caribbean. And he went there. It was a disaster. Over half of the people died. They were attacked by Indians. There were storms. It was awful. About 50 of them survived. But John Layard walked around in what is today the Dominican Republic and over into Central America, and he was spellbound. He had never seen, even if the fruit was the same, it was something in the old world, here it was bigger and tasted better. It was just astonishing. He had never seen anything like it. So he goes back to America, back to England, and he writes an account of the journey. Now, about 10 years later, John Layfield, who happens to be a scholar on Greek and ancient Hebrew writing, becomes part of the team that creates the 1611 King James Bible. In fact, John Layfield becomes part of the group that is translating the book of Genesis. In other words, a man who went to the New World, who saw and wrote about the extraordinary plant and animal life he saw there, becomes one of the men who will translate into English the biblical description of the Garden of Eden. In the beginning, all the world was America. This is John Bartram. We are celebrating the creation of a seed library. This is the greatest seed librarian of them all. He was born in Pennsylvania. He created a huge garden. It was called Bertram's Garden in 1728. And he packed up seeds and he sent them all over the world. They were called Bertram's boxes. And he would pack them with seeds from all of his garden. He would make these extensive travels all over America and pull these things together. The Chelsea Physic Garden in England, what would become the Kew Garden, got a lot of its original seed and a lot of its flower plants from America from John Bartram. He was one of the ones who really kind of sent all of this kind of stuff out. And everyone wanted plants and flowers from America because part of the age of discovery, not just in America, but also in Asia. If you see a list of all the flower plants and see where they come from off from all over the world, from Asia and India. But a lot of them are the result of someone bringing it back and giving stuff to a gardener somewhere. And so John Bartram was one of the first ones to do this. This is a famous painting by Asher Durand. Because what has happened between Bartram and here is the English Romantic movement, British Romanticism, with its emphasis on the importance of nature, going back out into nature for inspiration and finding creativity and experiencing the natural world. Part of that wells up in the 18 teens and the 1820s. Asher Durand painted this picture of two famous Americans. A writer and a painter. So if I can get there we are. The guy on the left here, that there is William Cullen Bryant, who was a major poet of the age. He was most famous in American anthologies today for the poem The Chambered Nautilus. And on the right, other side of him, that is the painter Thomas Cole. And you'll notice that Cole is gesturing with his brush out into the natural world. When Cole announced that he was going to go to Europe to study art, a lot of people were upset about that. Oh yeah, we know how that works. You go to England and you never come back. John Singleton Copley and Benjamin West, great American painters who went to Britain and made a name for themselves and never came back. So Cullen Bryant writes a poem for Cole. Thine eyes shall see the light of distant skies, yet cold thy heart shall bear to Europe's strand a living image of thy native land, such as on thy own glorious canvas lies. Fair scenes shall greet thee where they goes, fair but different, everywhere the traces of men, paths, homes, graves, ruins, heavy on ruins in Europe, from the lower glen, to where light streams from the alpine air. Gaze on them, till the tears shall dim thy sight, but keep the earlier, wilder image bright. Yeah, okay, you know what? Go to Europe. Learn all the stuff you got to learn to Europe, but come back here and paint the American landscape. And what does he do? He does that. He comes back, and Thomas Cole founds the Hudson River School of Painters. And, well, of course, the first school of painting in America would be landscape painting, wouldn't it? Because that was the most extraordinary thing, the thing everyone was so caught up and talked about. That leads us, of course, to Waldo Emerson, right? 1836, Nature, his essay, which talks about leave your books behind and go out into the natural world. Walk and view and feel the energy. The transcendentalism really is what America did with English Romanticism. You know, added a sheen of the spiritual over it, and the whole idea is to go out and it would engender creativity. And Emerson would be the great caller, calling forth in American literature a unique viewpoint. You know, and that painting there is a Thomas Cole painting on the cover of the book here. So it becomes part of it. And who's his greatest student? Thoreau, who goes to Walden, right? Now, Thoreau was at his little shack on Walden Pond. He moved in on July the 4th, 1845, Independence. He lived there for 2 months and 2 days. And when he left in July, that same month, a young girl in Amherst was finishing up at Amherst Academy. Her name was Emily Dickinson. She had been born in 1830. And for the first 10 years of her life, she had lived at the famous house here, the homestead. A lot of times you'll hear, they'll say well, she was born in this house and she died in this house. That's true, but that's not quite how it worked. She didn't live here all of her life. They actually lost control of this house. The grandfather had built it, and apparently was a bit of a dodgy dealer here and there. And the family got in some financial trouble. At one point, they were having to rent half of the house that their father had built. And eventually, when Emily is 10 years old, they actually moved to a house about a couple of blocks away on Pleasant Street. They lived there until 1855, and then in 1855, they moved back to this house. And she did live here from 1855 until the rest of her life. And this is where the garden that we associate with her was. And so, and here they all are as she is. There were 3 of them. On the left here is Emily. In the middle is Austin. And on the right is Sister Lavinia, known as Biddy. And the 2 of them were so close and did so many things together. The sisters in literature. You know, it really is a fascinating thing, isn't it? You have Jane and Cassandra Austen and Charlotte Bronte and Emily Bronte and Anne Bronte. And here too, a lot of the garden work, and looky there, sure enough, there's our flower in this picture as well at the bottom. You see the book open with the flower on it. And so from almost every image we've had so far of Emily Dickinson, it has her with a flower or a flower nearby or somewhere part of what she's doing. So what is a poet who was coming up in this tradition? She's reading Emerson and Thoreau, and she's reading Keats, and she's reading the Brontes. She has just gone to extraordinary education for what is basically high school, and then at the Amherst Academy. She studied botany. She created a herbarium. It was 66 pages long, and it's still available. I'll tell you where you can go online and see a huge digitalization of her herbarium of all the plants that she collected. She learned, literature. She learned Latin. She learned chemistry. And then she would spend 1 year at Holyoke Female Seminary in South Hadley, just a year. And then when she would come back there, she was about 17 or 18 years old. The daguerreotype comes from somewhere during those years. And then that's it. And so in terms of her formal schooling, after this, she's home and she has her garden. And so we are ready, I think, now to move into her garden. But I wanted there to be a gateway. So I imagine, the gateway going into the garden, there needs to be some sort of theme-setting idea, right? We need an overture before we go. And this is her overture. Some keep the Sabbath going to church. I keep it staying at home, with a bobolink for a chorister and an orchard for a dome. Some keep the Sabbath in surplice. I just wear my wings. And instead of tolling the bell for church, our little sexton sings. God preaches, a noted clergyman, and the sermon is never long. So instead of getting to heaven at last, I'm going all along. And of course, one of the things I love about this poem is the quotation marks around God. Yeah, you didn't put quotation notes around God in a poem written in the middle of the 19th century. You know, you can kind of see how Higginson couldn't quite follow what was going on here. You know, and it's often said that the reason her poetry is so raw, so much from the vein, is because she never really had an editor. Only about 7 or 8 poems are published in her lifetime. Most of all of her poems, and the current count is 1,789 poems by Emily. And her biographer, Richard Seward, said that, you know, there was no editor. There was no one going to Emily and patting her on the hand and saying, Emily, you can't say that. You can't put that way. And so there's always the sense with Emily that you're dealing with something primal. That there's a sense of almost pure, this is straight from the vein, it feels to me. You know, some critics have called her stuff terrifying because of this, because of the openness and the feel, the sense of it. And I think a part of it is that. I think a part of it is the fact that her stuff was never edited and it was never complete. Paul Valery once said that poetry is never finished, it is only abandoned. You know, and Emily would give multiple readings to her poems. She would have a word and a little asterisk over it, and then down at the bottom there would be 3 more words you could slot in there, depending on which one of you preferred or however you wanted. She would write multiple versions. And so a lot of it has to do with the fact that the poetry was a constantly ongoing thing. You know, it's so astonishing when you think that the 2 towering figures in 19th century poetry in America are Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman. And you could not pick 2 people further apart in some ways. And yet that's one thing I think they both shared, a sense of wanting to break rules. Emily was the great inward poet, you know. I'm nobody. Who are you? Walt Whitman was the great outward poet. I'm Walt Whitman, one of the roughs, a cosmos. And yet, you know, that a lot of the things that they share is this notion of doing it their own way. Whitman self-published Leaves of Grass. And to some extent, he never finished Leaves of Grass either. We have it, and this has got to be the most ominous kind of adjective to add to someone's book, the deathbed edition. We have a deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. He never quit working at it, never quit pulling it together, never quit tinkering with stuff. And Emily was that way too, so there's a sense in which her poetry is both unfinished in the fact that it's always under work, and then there are things that obviously she had done with it. Here's another one. So I'm going to share some of my favorite poems with you. New feet within my garden go. New fingers stir the sod. A troubadour upon the elm betrays the solitude. New children play upon the green. New weary sleep below. And still the pensive spring returns, and still the punctual snow. New children play upon the ground, and new weary sleep below. One of the things you can see a writer seeing in the garden is this constant death and renewal, right? The idea of the perennials, you know, it's dead, but it's not dead, it's just down there somewhere. Almost a sense of layers. We have the flowers that are blooming right now, and underneath it are the flowers that are sleeping, and they're weary, notice. The weary sleep because they've been open for months. You know, and so now they're sleeping. And this idea of renewal constantly comes up in her poetry. And again, it's the kind of thing a gardener working the land and seeing the constant transformation, the constant shifting of light is another thing she will talk about. I pull a flower from the woods. A monster with a glass computes the stamens in a breath and has her in a class. Now, I said she took botany when she was at Amherst Academy. And so this is kind of 2 people out pulling flowers. One pulls flowers for the beauty of the flower, and one is pulling with a glass. I have a picture right there on the right. That's Carl Linnaeus. He was a Swedish man who gave the first systemization of how plants. And the way you identify plants is you count the stamens and you count the pistils. It was a bit awkward because he was writing in the 18th century and come up with because think of it, it comes back to the age of discovery. There are thousands and thousands of new plants constantly. Literally, boats would dock in London and take 1,000 new plants that no one had ever seen before to the botanist and say, well, what is this? So there's got to be a system. The man who came up with the system, and there he's holding his Systema Natura, is Carl Linnaeus. And what he figured is that it all boils down to sexual organs, which was really awkward in the 18th century to say that about the plants. But we know they're just stamens and pistils. But that became a classification method. So what she's talking about here is the classification of it and the different things different people do with it. You know, so she is pulling a flower from the woods, but somebody else is coming through with a glass. And look at that verb, computes. You see why sometimes she feels so modern. She's using computes in exactly the form we would, and exactly the way, using it as a scientific brain way of going about something. Computes the stamens and has her in a class. And of course you have quotation marks over class because not only classification, but also, of course, this is what students do in class, isn't it? They stand there and they pry things apart as part of the education. And so this is someone who had been there and sees the two different kinds of things. This is part of her herbarium. She listed over 400 plants. It's 66 pages long. And it's at the Houghton Library in Harvard. And there is a digital version, a high-density digital version of it, free online. And I really recommend you come and look at it. It's extraordinary. She not only the plants themselves, but also the preservation of how she grouped them together. There's lots of wonderful play in some of the ways she pulled these things together. This is her writing the Latin names, so she knew all of that, but it's really just, it's a different expression of her poetic insight. The way she grouped these things together on the page. And you can blow them up to huge detail on the website, so I really recommend you doing that. And she has a poem about this as well. I held a jewel in my fingers and went to sleep. The day was warm and the winds were prosy. I said, 'twill keep. I woke and chid my honest fingers. The gem was gone, and now an amethyst remembrance is all I own. So it may have been destined for a vase on the table, but now it'll go in the book. And that preservation of the root, she loved to put flowers in letters, especially nosegays. And she would send them off. And she, the man who sent her Jane Eyre to read, she sent the letter back. She sent a letter back to him talking about how much she had loved it. And she filled it with leaves from the front yard. And imagine, she said, if there was a review of the beauty of this book from God on every one of these pages, would he approve? So she loved to do that. She loved to do that. She filled her garden, just some of the flowers, roses, lilacs, peonies, sweet williams, daisies, foxgloves, poppies, daffodils, crocuses, hyacinths. She stated it all the time. When they got back into the house in 1855, her father, Edward, did a lot of rehabilitation, and he added a conservatory on the side so that they could do year-round plants, and during the winter they could keep things going as well. And she's written about that. I had a picture of it. I don't think I have it here now. But he very much encouraged her in what they were doing. And she had a complicated relationship with her father. She once said that my father buys me books but encourages me not to read them. He's afraid they will joggle the mind. But he did buy her books. I think it's interesting going back to Higginson. I mean, the Atlantic Monthly had just started out when he wrote his article, but they had a copy of it. And so Emily's father had a large library, and she had access to all of it. Now, this is one of my favorite poems, too. Would you like summer? Taste of ours. Spices? Buy here. Ill, we have berries for the parching. Weary, furloughs of down. Perplexed, estates of violet. Trouble never looked on. Captive, we bring reprieve of roses. Fainting flasks of air. Even for death, a fairy medicine. But which is it, sir? She's turned into a carnival barker. She's standing there in front of her plants, pitching. And I would tell you that she did this. one of the things she won, the one award she won in her life, she won second place for her rye and Indian bread at the second annual cattle show that came through town. And so she may have been in some similar moment, but I think this is wonderful, the idea of the bark rip. They're trying to sell summer the way your snake oil salesman would sell some sort of medicine, right? You know, ill, we have berries for the parching. Weary, furrows of down, perplexed estates of violet, trouble never looked on. I think it shows the voices that come up. One of the things that can sometimes happen to you when you encounter a poet in a collection of anthologies or stuff like that, I sometimes lament how we find poetry in school. You know, it's assigned. You're given a block of you're told, read these 6 Emily Dickinson poems and answer these questions, and we'll talk about it tomorrow in class. Everything about that's wrong. Because you can't discover everything on your own, first of all. And with poetry especially, and when we think about the books and the writings that we love, it's usually the stuff we found on our own. You know, or someone recommended and say, here, you've got to try this, or you've got to read this. I distrust official canons, but I believe passionately in personal canons. The things that we've encountered in our life that have become important to us. Because they become part of your story too. And so with Emily's, you know, I think that it's been said that she's the great poet of rediscovery. Because there's the Emily you find in school, and then there's the Emily you discover in college, in a feminist class, in a feminist literature class. Then there's the Emily you find as a gardener or as someone who goes outside. And then there's the Emily that you find as you're getting older. When she lived in not the house that she died in, but the other house, it was right beside a cemetery. And it was reported that she often saw funerals going through back there. So when we sometimes wonder about death cropping up so much in her poetry, you know, this is something that they were very close to and that she was literally seeing out the window of her room for many years. And we're not seeing some of this. One of the things I'm doing here, you know, because I could not stop for death, I'm trying to introduce you to some of her less famous poems because they tie in with her love of nature too. But there's also some things that show there were many, many Emily Dickinsons. You know, Thoreau was famous for saying, "I have traveled much in Concord," but you know, Emily had traveled much in her backyard. And Walt Whitman can say that I am large, I contain multitudes. But Emily Dickinson can say, I am small and I contain worlds. You know, it is, and so you keep discovering her. And so in some respects, I wanted to introduce you to one of the aspects of Emily that I like. Here she is, talking about spring, the spring beauty, small, pink, small, and punctual, aromatic, low, covert in April, candid in May, dear to the moss, known to the knoll, next to the robin in every human soul, bold little beauty, bedecked with thee, nature forswears antiquity, always renewing. And I think that's just how the kind of delicacy, you can feel those words almost like petals. Right? You know, I think that's something that she was able to capture. The term for how a poem looks on a page is called topography. And she's very aware of that. That's one reason why the first poems, her first collection of poetry that Higginson had been involved in, and a woman named Mabel Loomis Todd, came out in 1890. And they completely organized her poetry, and they corrected the pronunciation, and they picked a word. If there were 4 words that you could choose from, they picked one. And so one of the things that's been crucial to Emily Dickinson's discovery is the fact, going back to her original manuscripts and seeing how she put these words on a page. I was looking at, there's a picture of a white dress in her bedroom in her house at Amherst. And the first thing I thought, when I saw the white dress, was that can't be right because there's no pockets. She's a pocket writer. Scribbling things and sticking them in her pocket. Scribbling things and sticking them in her pocket. And she would do this all day long. And then at night, she would take all these bits and pieces out and lay them out and construct her poetry with them. They're bits and pieces. They found poems written on the back of chocolate wrappers, poems embedded in the middle of recipes, all kinds of little things she would scribble on. Parts of poems. There's even one poem where they have an envelope where you open it up, it has that little triangular top. She wrote a poem about a house inside the house shape of the envelope. You know? And that's lost in a book if you pull that out into a stanza or something like that. And I think she knew that. I think that's another reason why she told Higginson that she wasn't, you know, that her interest in publishing her stuff was as far as from the firmament to the fen, from the sky to the ground, that she wasn't. But I think part of her knew that standard publication would take something out of what she was doing. Here's another wonderful description. The dandelion's pallid tube astonishes the grass. The winter instantly becomes an infinite alas. The tube uplifts a signal bud, and then a shouting flower, the proclamation of the sons that sepulture is over. Summer has arrived, and there it is. But what about that? Astonishes the grass, shouting flower. And here's another one, the way she'll take imagery from other things and shift it into her poetry. Here she's taken of all things banking and economic terms. Then I have shares in primrose banks, daffodil dowries, spicy stocks, dominions, empires, broad as dew, bags of doubloons, adventurous bees, brought from me from firmament seas, and purple from Peru. Because one of the magical things about a garden is that the flowers come from all over the world. By the time that, you know, she's cultivating stuff here, you can have flowers from everywhere. She once said, in regard to the conservatory that her father built, that she was only had to cross the floor and she was in the Spice Islands because of the flowers that were there, that they were kept during the wintertime. And so that idea of traveling, sometimes it feels to me that with Emily Dickinson's poetry, that there has been this spectacular detonation somewhere distant. And these are the pieces that come to us from it. There's always the sense that behind these carefully handful of words, there's these huge things churning. It's the vastness of her mind, I think, back there. But I think there's one of the things that I keep coming to her poetry over and over and over is there's so much back there. There's so much thought that has gone into it. These kind of mental leaps from line to line to line. And it never stops being fascinating. And it all comes together in probably my single favorite poem. This. To make a prairie, it takes a clover and one bee. One clover and a bee. And reverie. The reverie alone will do if bees are few. You know, that goes right back to the absolute heart of English Romanticism. Wordsworth would say something else. He would take book and book and book and lines and lines and lines to say it. But what he is saying is that the imagination and what we see in the nature fuse together. That the state that we get in, the insight we reach, happens because of what we both see, as Wordsworth would say, and half create. And Emily has pulled it all here in a single image of a clover and a bee. And the idea of a prairie, the idea of what the mind conjures. Poems are triggers. And they open doors. And a certain array of words can become a different trigger for different people. This is why one poem can speak to someone and one poem you can go, I didn't get that. You know, but a lot of it, that's kind of part of how it works. Or why something you cannot understand it one time and read it 3 years later and think, oh my God, that's brilliant. That's fabulous. You know, because they come at you at different times. And this is true of the poet as well. What they're writing and what they're thinking, different phases of their life become part of how they're working it into it. And so, a lot of the poems I'm giving you here, this one's undated and was found later. But most of them are coming from the 1860s, during her biggest period of writing was during the Civil War. Between 1860 and 1865, she wrote almost 1,000 poems. Extraordinary productivity, and it just seemed to really churn out of her. By the 1870s, she seemed to have slowed down a lot. She was still writing her letters. The recluse we think about, the person who seemed to have stayed in her house all the time, by the late 60s, by the early 60s, and certainly by the end of the decade, she was pretty much not leaving her house very much. But she stayed in touch with the neighbors. One of the things she would do, she had a basket that she would fill up. She loved to bake. And so she would fill a basket up at the window of her bedroom and wheel it down to kids at the bottom. And she was always doing that. She loved children. I think the reference to the kids and the kids growing up in one of her gardens. And always about that, there was a couple, of course, teens and kids being kids. They were always crossing her yard when they're not supposed to. And but she was always understanding about that. One more thing. I'll do this next. And she had a sense of humor. She could be really funny. I love this. Over the fence, strawberries grow. Over the fence, I could climb if I tried. I know berries are nice. But if I stained my apron, God would certainly scold. Oh dear. I guess if he were a boy, he'd climb if he could. I read that and I think, I would give so much for Emily Dickinson to have met Louisa May Alcott. You know, because they were, I wonder what they would have talked about, because I think there's a sensibility that's very similar between the two of them. You know, and then here's another one I love. I don't always understand this. I'm setting up here and reeling this stuff off. But there's always things in these poems that I'm like, I'm not quite sure what she's doing there. It should be. There should always be something like that. But I want to read this one because I love some of the imagery in it and the idea of the mushroom as well. The mushroom is the elf of plants. At evening, it is not. At morning, in a troubled hut, it stop upon a spot. As if it tarries always, and yet its whole career is shorter than a snake's delay, and fleeter than a tear. 'Tis vegetarian's juggler, the joy of alibi, doth like a bubble antedate and like a bubble high. I feel as if the grass was pleased to have it intermit, this surreptitious scan of summer's circumspect. Had nature any supple face, or could she one contemn? Had nature an apostate, that mushroom, it is him. And so I do love the fact that the idea of the mushroom, because they're not there one day and then they are, and then they're not. And that notion of it being kind of the trickster of the garden, or even of the field, showing up and gone and showing up and gone. I don't know what she means, just like a bubble antedate and like a bubble high. I have no idea what that means. You know, and I'm sure you may have something else to see out of this as well. But I love the idea of nature and had nature an apostate. Apostate. That's a word that resonates with her. Someone not following the rules. Someone not doing things the way they've been told to do. You can see why she would love mushrooms. Why she would see them, it's the thing in the garden that isn't quite doing what it's supposed to do. That's the kind of thing she's going to write a poem about. Something that is separating away. God made a little gentian. It tried to be a rose and failed, and all the summer laughed. But just before the snows, there rose a purple creature that ravished all the hill. And summer hid her forehead, and mockery was still. The frosts were her condition. The Tyrian would not come. Tyrian is purple. The dye used to create Roman roads. The purple Tyrian would not come until north invoke it. Creator, shall I bloom? About the late blooming flower that everyone doesn't think is going to do anything. Are they going to come up this year? And then suddenly they do. And of course, they're always spectacular. When they come, when you think that they're not, that they didn't survive, and they're not going to come up, you know, and here they are. And that notion of late blooming is something else I think that runs through a lot. Again, it's the kind of image a gardener would see, right? That there are certain times of the year for certain things to happen. that certain types of combinations of weather and soil and rain all have to come together so that something will find its way out of the ground. You can see a poet being drawn to imagery like that. This is the kind of stuff that churns in her head. It's the kind of thing she saw every day. And when she's sitting at night at her little desk there at the window, pulling all of these kind of things together. Usually we don't see the groundwork. The story is that Johannes Brahms wrote over 20 string quartets that he destroyed before the 4 he gave the world. Didn't want you to see the early versions of things, you know? And so I think one of the things that makes Emily Dickinson so extraordinary is in her poetry we see how it looked on the page and how she was thinking about it. We can see her thinking her way through lines on it. And it's always just, you know, the poet's process is always so fascinating. And Dickinson in particular, I think, how she got to where she is. So this is one of the few last poems I'm going to do. And I love this. A light exists in spring. One of the things, Christopher Benfey, who teaches American literature at Holyoke, said that Emily had a high-density focusing lens in her imagination that allowed her to just focus down on things. And of course, part of that has to do with light, being aware always of the light. She would talk about a certain slant of light in another poem, how things can shift everything. Think of Monet, you know, painting all of the Rome Cathedral that he painted, all these 30 paintings of the entrance, you know, the piles of hay that he painted, the idea of constantly catching the same image, but how it shifts as light went over it too. She's doing that here. A light exists in spring, not present on the year at any other period. When March is scarcely done, a color stands abroad on solitary fields that science cannot overtake, but human nature feels. It waits upon the lawn. It shows the furthest tree. Upon the furthest slope you know, it almost speaks to you. And then, as horizons step or noons report away without the formula of sound, it passes and we stay. A quality of loss affecting our content, as trade had suddenly encroached upon a sacrament. Over and over in her descriptions of things going on in nature, she'll use religious terms like sacrament. And I love this idea of the light going above us, horizons, the noon. It passes and we stay. And that reverses how we tend to put that, right? We tend to think we're the evanescent ones. We're the ones here briefly. It's the world, it's the earth that's here permanently. It's the thing that's going to stay. But she spins that around. It's the moving day crossing her and the natural world that's being lit. That's what's leaving. And we stay. It's a wonderful spin on that. Longing is like the seed that wrestles in the ground, believing if it intercede, it shall at length be found. The hour and the zone, each circumstance unknown, what constancy must be achieved before it see the sun. And again, the journey of the seed, right? What it takes to work its way up into the sun. And that line, it shall at length be found, takes me out of her poetry and back to her sister Lavinia. The last couple of years of Emily Dickinson's life, she was very sick. She had Bright's disease, which led, they think, to kidney failure. And in 1886, she died May 15th of 1886. And in her will, she's told Lavinia to destroy all of her papers. So Lavinia destroyed the letters. That's why we don't have Higginson's letters to her. We have her letters to him. The letters to her were all destroyed. But then Lavinia, and just think about this, she's in the little room It's a house in Amherst that Emily has not much left in the last 20 years. She goes into her closet, she pulls a box out, and inside of it are thousands of poems. Emily would group them together into what were called fascicles, so she would take 6 or 8 poems and weave them, bind them together. And there were over 1,000 of these in that box. Thousands of poems. And everybody knew she wrote poetry. A couple of poems have been published. Everyone got a letter. A lot of one of the reasons how many poems we have by her keeps shifting is we keep finding letters with a poem of hers in them that suddenly show up. So she included a lot of poems and letters and stuff like that. So people who knew her knew she wrote. But even Lavinia, even her sister, had no idea there were that many poems, that was done. And so she decided that, well, you know what? Emily didn't say anything about poems. So she didn't destroy them. In fact, she said later she regretted having destroyed the letters, as so many biographers have been as well. But you know, when Emily Dickinson died, about a year or so before she died, she wrote what some have called her final poem. She wrote a little letter to her cousins. It was called Little Cousins Called Back Emily. And Joyce Carol Oates points out that called back is actually a printer's phrase. It referred to something that had been sent out that had an error in the printing and had to be called back so that it could be corrected. So that even in the last years of her life, when she wasn't writing quite as much, there was still that snapping brain, you know, still working, still seeing multiple readings and everything like that. She's hard to read. She once said, biography first convinces us of the fleeing of the biographied. And of all writers to kind of tap down, she's the most difficult. And yet, in some ways, we have that little picture of her, and we have these poems that open out so tremendously. And one of the letters that we have from, in her responses to Higginson apparently asked her what she did for companions. What do you do? What is your daily life like? And she said, "You ask of my companions, hills, sir, and the sundown, and a dog, large as myself, that my father bought me. They are better than beings," they being the dog and sundown and hills, "better than beings, but do not tell. They are better than beings because they know, but do not tell. As the noise in the pool at noon excels the sound of my piano." He asked her at one point, too, what did she look like? She wrote, "I have no portrait now." It's not true, of course. We knew there was a little daguerreotype. But she says, "I am small like the wren, and my hair is bold like the chestnut burr, and my eyes like the sherry in the glass that the guest leaves." What a thing it must have been to get letters from her. She was once asked, why didn't she come out and be involved with people more? And she said, "Well, when it comes to other people, I don't like to be around them because they talk of hallowed things out loud and embarrass my dog." And she loved her dog. Her dog's name was Carlo. And Carlo died in 1966 after about 1866. And she'd had him for almost 20 years. And it's been said that one of the reasons in the late 60s she seems to have stayed inside from then on is because she didn't have Carlo to go out with her anymore. And so that's where the call back comes from. But you know what? We can't end it there. Let's do one more short line. "The brain is wider than the sky, for to put them side by side, the one the other will contain with ease, and you beside." That is Emily Dickinson. Thank you. And I'm going to do three quick recommendations. If you would like to learn more, as they say, I cannot recommend highly this book by Martha McDowell, Emily Dickinson's Gardening Life, which was wonderful. Went into much more detail than I would do about the actual plants she had. She's written articles as well about how you can have an Emily Dickinson garden. This book by Martha Ackman, These Fever Days, 10 Pivotal Moments in the Making of Emily Dickinson, which is absolutely, it's one of the more recent. There are some large biographies. It's been pointed out that for such an often gentle writer, her biographies tend to have heavy names. My wars are laid away in books. Lives like loaded guns. And that's true. But this is a more recent book that's not a big giant biography, but it takes 10 moments in her life that are great. And if you have not seen it, I cannot recommend highly enough this stunning documentary about Emily Dickinson. They made a movie. Terrence Davies did a film about her called A Quiet Passion a couple of years ago. And at the same time they made the movie, they also made this documentary. And it's absolutely riveting. And I particularly recommend it because they show a lot of her actual handwritten poems. In other words, you get to see what these things look like on the little bits and scraps of it. There's they do this one glorious visual where they have them all flowing across in front of you. All these little bitty scraps and bits of paper that have a couple of words on them. And that's where she did her work, you know. That's what a writer does. You find the space, even if it's a small space, and you find the words. And I think Emily Dickinson is immensely rewarding. Every time I go back to her, I find something I didn't see there before, or maybe she sees something in me I didn't see before that's coming out. But I think that's one of the things that the poetry carries so much power. So I encourage you to follow up on some of this. And thank you again for coming out and being part of the program tonight. Thank you.